Hello, everyone, and welcome to All's Authors Live. I'm Marianne Shuko. I'm the author of Blue Hydrangeas, an Alzheimer's love story, and a founder and manager here at All's Authors.
Mhm.
We are the global community of authors writing about Alzheimer's and dementia from personal experience to light the way for others. And we welcome you to this panel presentation on the long haul, the long-term impact of caregiving. Thank you for sharing your precious time with us. We love to see where our participants are zooming in from, so please write your name and location in the chat box. I'd like to introduce some of the members of our management team who are with us this afternoon. Christy Byrne-Yates is my podcast partner and co-moderator for this event. A member of our management team and board of directors, she also manages our YouTube channel, and she's the author of Building a Legacy of Love, Thriving in the Sandwich Generation. We also have Vicky Tapia, another founder, and she is the author of Somebody Stole My Iron, a family memoir of dementia. And Susan Landis, who is manager on board of directors and does the custom caregiver collections. She's the author of In Search of Rainbows, and she will be our guest author for our Books and Chit Chat meeting this month on February 25th. We have two other members of our management team here today as well, but they are on the panel, so I will introduce them then. A little bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel as well as all of our podcast platforms. And we are also using it as part of Podcast-thon, a global event for podcasters to raise money for their favorite charities. And guess who's our favorite charity? That's right. We are raising money for all authors. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based in the United States, and feel free to donate if you are able. We love that. All the participants are muted. If you would like to speak, please leave a message in the chat box or raise your hand. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Jean Lee's parents were both diagnosed on the same day with Alzheimer's disease. Through her memoir, Alzheimer's Daughter, readers travel a journey beginning with a World War II romance through aging and first suspicions to finally her parents' last breaths. Jean is also a founder of All's Authors and works as an acquisitions editor, social media manager, board secretary, and a coordinator of the custom caregiver collections. Jean lives in Ohio. Hello, Jean.
Hi, everyone.
Ann Campanella is zooming in from North Carolina and is the award-winning author of 3 memoirs and 4 poetry collections. Formerly a magazine and newspaper journalist, her writing has been published worldwide. Her memoir, Motherhood Lost and Found, was named one of the best Alzheimer's books of all time by Book Authority 2 years in a row. Ann is our resident poet and has twice received the Poet Laureate Award from the North Carolina Poetry Society. She has served on the All's Authors management team since 2017 and manages our Instagram feed and helps coordinate our custom caregiver collections as well as serve on our board. Hi, Ann.
Hey, thanks so much for everybody coming out today. Look forward to this discussion.
Yeah, we're excited about that. Loretta Woodward Veney from Maryland is an author and motivational speaker who has delivered more than 300 presentations on the topics of aging, caregiving, and dementia. She's the author of 3 books for caregivers, Being My Mom's Mom, her memoir of caregiving, of her caregiving journey, Refreshment for the Caregiver's Spirit, a book of inspiration, and an intergenerational coloring book entitled Colors Flowing from My Mind. She may be best known for her work as a Lego ambassador, sharing her love of Legos as an engagement tool for those living with dementia. Welcome, Loretta.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. Looking forward to the discussion as well.
Yeah. And last but not least is Dave Iverson, a writer, documentary film producer and director, and retired broadcast journalist. When he was 59, he moved in with his 95-year-old mom, Adelaide, when she could no longer care for herself. His memoir, Winter Stars, An Elderly Mother, An Aging Son, and Life's Final Journey, tells the story of the 10-year caregiving odyssey they shared until her passing at the age of 105. He's from California. Thank you so much, Dave. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right. So I want to get off just a little bit to start with each one of you explaining to us a little bit about yourself and your journey, including how many years you spent caring for your parent or parents. And we can start with Dave.
Okay, thank you. As Marianne just mentioned, I was a broadcast journalist working at the NPR PBS station in San Francisco at the time. I was very close to my mom. I have two brothers, so while it's often the assumption that it will be the female daughter who will be the caregiver, my mom really didn't have a choice because it was me or one of my brothers, and I was the most likely suspect. But it was much more than I ever imagined, which I'm sure is the norm. My view going in was, well, my mom and I get along great. Why will this be a problem? And I continued to work, which I was lucky to be able to do, because we were able to have a caregiver during the day. So my caregiving was limited to night times and weekends. But it was, I would say, the most challenging thing I'd ever done in my life, continues to be, but also probably one of the most deeply rewarding, along with being a parent myself and a spouse. It was all of those things and more. And while I thought it was a short-term assignment, since my mom was in her 90s when I moved in, it turned out to go on for a decade until her passing at the age of 105. But I've never regretted making that choice.
Thank you so much. Loretta, did you want to share your story?
Sure. So I always say about caregiving is one of the things that in our lives that doesn't have an expiration date. So like Dave said, how long could this be? And so I say that all the time. And so in my case, I was the youngest of my mom's two children. She and I were very close, and she and my sister not so much. And so we used to joke about it when my sister was 9 years older. We used to joke about it when I was a teenager that I would be the one that would end up with mom because my sister didn't have an ounce of patience. So we knew it would be me. And so she was diagnosed in 2006. She was 77 at the time, which was shocking because nobody in our family ever had dementia. So she was the first one. So I was going to be like the test case. So that was terrifying in and of itself. So it was quite the journey. A lot happened during that 16 years. But like Dave, I would absolutely use the word rewarding, but it was really challenging, even though she didn't live with me. That was my mother's decision. And I'll say more about that when we get to the financial piece. My mother made us sign a document when I was 14 that said we would not force her to move in with us. So, and so when she got to be, when she didn't know anybody or anything, my friends would say, you can move her to your house now and save all that money because she won't know. But I would know. I saw her every day. She was in a group home in one case for a few years, less than a mile from my house. And so I saw her almost every day, even during COVID. And so I worked at Homeland Security from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. I chose those hours so I could go help them get her up in the morning. And at 2 o'clock, I could go, I could leave. I was 20 minutes away. I could leave and come back before sundowners visited us. So it was quite the journey.
Great. Thank you so much. Jean, can you share your story a little bit?
Sure. My sister and I was the hometown daughter. My sister lived in Florida. I live in Ohio. We began noticing changes in our parents at around age 80. I started documenting those in a journal that my sister suggested I keep so that we could talk about specifics when we spoke together, which was nearly daily. It took 6 years from those first suspicions to actually get a doctor's diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and that came on the same day for both parents, which seems unbelievable and hard to take or accept. But honestly, it was something we sought, and the diagnosis gave us validation on what we were seeing happen. My mother lived about 10 years from those first suspicions. My father around 11 years. I was working full time and stopping at their house daily on my way home from work. We had to move them after the validation of the official diagnosis to a senior community. And then, you know, the gruesome part of the darkest part of the journey for me was cleaning out their house while they were still living. And selling the house so that we had the money for their care. Because they were diagnosed together, they had a hand-in-hand decline and never realized that the other one was failing. And so they remained in love with one another and totally supportive of one another. And during the clean out of the house, I found their World War II love letters, which are the chapter beginnings. And their writing to one another during that time is really the most beautiful part of the book, in my opinion.
Love that. Thank you so much. And Ann, can you share your story?
Sure. I was actually in my early 30s. I was a newspaper editor, writer, and I lived on a horse farm. So I was just in the middle of life, my career. My husband and I were hoping to have children. And as my mother started showing signs of Alzheimer's, I was going through a series of miscarriages. And that went through many years, almost 10 years. And I got pregnant and we had a daughter. But it was 14 years of caregiving. Started out being long-term caregiving long distance caregiving, because my parents were on the coast and I was near Charlotte, North Carolina. And eventually, after my daughter was born, we made the decision to move my mom close to us because it was just impossible for me to juggle caring for a young child and caring for her. My siblings did take a role in it. And at different times, they stepped up and did different things. But I was usually kind of the linchpin that I had to make a lot of the hard decisions. As Dave said, it was a journey that was so very emotionally taxing, physically exhausting, yet I learned so much, and I wouldn't necessarily wish it on other people, but I would not take it away from my own experience because it changed me as a person.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we like to think of there being 5 pillars in caregiving, and we're going to try to talk about each one of them as much as we can this time that we have together. So I want to start with the emotional toll, as some of our authors have mentioned. The dementia caregiver journey is taxing, like Ann said. And that is one of the most significant challenges faced by long-term dementia caregivers. As the disease progresses, caregivers often witness the gradual decline of their loved one's cognitive abilities and personality that can lead to feelings of grief, loss, despair. The constant stress and worry can also contribute to anxiety and depression. Caregivers may experience a range of complex emotions, such as guilt, anger, and resentment. So this is a whole ball of wax brewing. These feelings can arise from the challenges of balancing caregiving responsibilities with other commitments, such as your job, as Ann and Dave said, or children, raising kids, or from the frustration of dealing with the behavioral changes that are associated with dementia. Please tell us which of these emotional tolls affected you the most. We will start with Loretta.
Ooh. So I think the loss and grief, and let me also say, I meant to say in the introduction, today would have been my mom's 96th birthday. So I got all kinds of emotions going on today too. Well, I'm going to have some cake when we get done. I think that for me, it was, kind of the grief. It was a really challenging thing. One of the best parts, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I know one of the best parts about dementia for me was that it did erase a lot of my mom's anxiety. So that made it a little easier for me. She was always scared to be in the car and didn't like people and didn't want to be around people. So that really softened. So that made that part easier. What was difficult emotionally was a couple of weeks after my mom was diagnosed with dementia, my sister was diagnosed with MS. And so for a while, I had them both. My sister first lost her vision, which was a very interesting symptom of MS. And so, but I had this plan. I'm a planner. I think very much like Marianne, I'm a planner. So I had all this stuff planned out. I had a little journal. And that went well until year 10. My husband was a retired DC cop, so he was able to do almost everything for my mother while I worked. And in year 10, he died while we were on vacation. Mm-hmm. So that was terrifying. So I think emotionally, that was probably obviously my lowest point. My sister and my husband compounded that they died on the same day, 5 years apart. So it was just one of those things. So my emotional thing was here, but I think one of the things we would say as caregivers is that you have to have a good community. And my church community, they asked me to make a list of all the things that my husband had done for my mom, and each one of them took a thing off that list. And so that kind of saved me while I was taking a couple of years to get my little act together. My mother, I never told her. My sister or my husband died. I didn't know what that was. My sister and my mom weren't that close, as I said, but and she had forgotten she had 2 kids by the time my sister died anyway. My husband's death scared me in a lot of ways, most notably because he and my mom were inseparable. But she saw him once in a PBS special we were in, and she said, "There he is," but she didn't. That was the only emotion there. So I think the roller coaster of just being me and her at the last 6.5 years, I was like, don't let anything happen to me. So that was terrifying. So that was most of my anxiety, that last part. So much so that when COVID hit, I put my house in a trust for her. So if I got hit by a bus or I died of COVID, the sale of my house would pay for her care, which was very expensive, for me. It was cool when my husband was alive and we had 2 incomes, and all the money I had to help pay for her. That was something. Anyway, the emotional part was, really just wanted to be the best for her, but realizing after everybody else died, she was the oldest of 4 siblings. She outlived everybody. And so you kind of like, So I kept trying to pace myself, because I had no idea how long it would last. So that was the hardest part for me, emotionally.
Wow, I'm sure that's a lot. My goodness. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So much there. Yeah.
Okay, so Jean, why don't you share with us the emotional?
Overwhelmingly, the biggest emotional toll on me was guilt. My parents were peaceful people, loving people, good parents. We did not have conflict in my home growing up. We were respectful daughters. And to have to come to the point that I had to make decisions to safeguard them, even though they remained good and loving partners to one another, that anger about the change in their living situations and their lack of independence was focused on my sister and I. Mm-hmm. And just the thought of having to turn that around and make decisions that in their mind felt negative, produced great guilt in me, and honestly still does. There are a lot of times that I think back that, they've been gone since 2010 and 2011. And I ask myself, what would they think of what I did, what I had to do, and can they forgive me? And in truth, All's Authors has helped me heal from that, because I'm surrounded by the rest of you who have also had to make those decisions. And the writing of my book was a very private journey with them. And to publish it, I never really thought I would publish it. It was written for my family, But to click that publish button, I really thought I would be struck by lightning and die. But I realized through all authors that we provide something very helpful to others who are on the path, and that heals me, and we heal one another.
Very well said, Jean. Thank you so much. Anne, what were some of your challenges with emotions?
Well, it's interesting because my experience was very different from Jean's. We've had the opportunity to talk a lot. Guilt was never part of my experience, probably because I knew my mother. She was a writer also, and she used to write about topics that were very sort of the types of things that people didn't talk about. So she understood my desire, or I believed she would understand my desire to shed light on this disease that I didn't understand at all when she began showing signs of it. My first emotions were probably shock and just terrible grief, because my mom and I were so close, and she had always been just a light in my life, always supportive, always gentle and caring. And suddenly she was angry. She was suspicious of me. I was like, what's happening? I had no clue. And being in my early 30s, I really wasn't around a lot of people. I really wish I'd had All's authors at the time. I wasn't around people who were familiar or comfortable talking about Alzheimer's and dementia. So yes, shock, grief, and just I felt like my world had imploded, because mom was truly a pillar in my life, and suddenly that pillar was crumbling.
Thank you so much. David, can you add to that?
I'll try. I really appreciate what Loretta and Jean and Ann have all said about this. It's a reminder to me that each of our stories is different, as obvious as a point as that is. And I think sometimes, you know, when we're going through the caregiving experience, there's a tendency to feel, even though caregiving is extraordinarily common, you know, there are 50-some million family caregivers in this country, yet we feel like, you know, we're experiencing this unique thing that no one else has ever gone through. And I think it's helpful to be reminded of how much we have in common, and yet how different our stories can be. I think for me, I would say two things. One is, I should be clear that my mom did not have dementia when I moved in with her. She was just 95 and could no longer live alone, but she was still very sharp and very engaged and aware. But I think for me, I would say two things. One is just the relentlessness of it, you know, that it just doesn't stop. And you realize in time that what you think is so hard and challenging, you will look back on in time as the good old days. That's actually when it was kind of okay. It just never quits. And I think that, and that it's so physical. You know, I think we don't talk about that probably as much as we should. Caregiving is really physical. It's intimate. You learn how to move someone from bed to commode and back again. And all of that, you know, helping someone in the bathroom in time, that became just not such a big deal for me. But initially, the idea of helping your mom in the bathroom is, you know, but it goes on and on. There's a relentlessness to caregiving that I think is really tough to contend with. The other thing I'd say that we haven't talked about yet is anger. Like Anne, I didn't feel the guilt that Jean described, but I got angry, and that was a revelation to me. I would never have guessed that I would have yelled at my mom, especially during the dementia time. I'll just one quick example. I remember once blowing up at my mom for reasons I cannot even recall. And she started crying. And my reaction to her was to say, go ahead and cry. And then I remember stomping out of the room like a teenager, slamming the door and standing in the garage. And I remember just hearing the rain falling on the roof in the garage and thinking, what's happening to me? How have I become this guy who yells at his now 100-year-old mother? And then going back down and sitting beside her. And then I was the one who burst into tears. And she reached out her hand towards me, and all she said was, "Don't cry, David, don't cry." And that's kind of it. You get all of it when you're a caregiver, I think. You get tears, you get laughter, you get joy, you get sorrow and sadness, you get all of it. And I think that is immensely challenging. But I also think that within that, and within those moments, those tears, there's great beauty. And it puts you right at the heart of what matters most in life.
So well said. Christy, can you comment on all of this? Talk about emotions.
Yeah, I was so moved by what all of you said. And it really is a testament to how what David just said, there's so much we have in common, and yet every situation is very uniquely different. And you all had very different things you were handling. I mean, Loretta, all the different losses you were having at the time, and Ann, your losses, just so moving. And I really get, Jean, the like, I'm now telling my parents things like, who am I to do that? I get that. And David, I really get the feeling anger at times, like where'd that come from? And what I wanted to say too is we're going to talk about physical strain, but I think these emotions take a lot out of us physically too. They take so much out of us physically. We don't always think about how much our bodies are worn out by just this stew of emotions that we're feeling all the time. And until you're in it, you don't really, it's hard to explain to somebody else. So I'm so glad we're talking about this. And I really cherish all of you just being so vulnerable and sharing all of this. And I think it does help. And I think, to your point, Anne, had I known about Al's authors when I was going through my time, oh my gosh, what a comfort, because, and that's why I feel so passionate about being here with all of you today and doing the work that all of us on Al's authors do, because it's hard to express how much we need each other to hear each other and share. So it's great. It's wonderful. But so I just wanted to put a little spin on that, because I think the emotional leads right into the physical. So do you want me to just jump into that one for us, Marianne?
Sure, if you want to start off, that's great.
Sure. So I just wanted to say, so the physical strain, long-term dementia caregiving can also take a significant physical toll, as we just talked about. But caregivers may find themselves constantly on call, sacrificing sleep and rest to attend to loved ones' needs. And it can lead to physical exhaustion, chronic pain, weakened immune system. That's a big one. And additionally, the physical demands of caregiving, such as lifting and transferring, can increase risk of injury. So I guess starting with, jumping in again, how each of you maybe briefly talk about how did you cope with physical challenges, and maybe share an example. So maybe we'll go back to Jean, you want to start us off?
Sure. I would say the physical strain for me was just exhaustion. And I was not lifting or caring for my parents. They lived independently through 6 years of this time. They lived in their own home. I was working full time though, as an elementary school teacher, third graders, and which is physically exhausting in itself. Yet managing those 38-year-olds each day was easier for me than going to my parents' house each day afterward and doing the dishes, filling their meds, making sure they had enough groceries. I had predictable outcomes within my professional work, even though it was with 8-year-olds. And there was no predictability in what I was going to find with my parents. And in that, it just became so exhausting. And then after I moved them and I was cleaning out their house every night after work, I went there, and it was a hoarding kind of a situation. That was such a dark time, and also just so physically exhausting. And throw menopause in there. I wasn't sleeping, and because there was just so much rolling through my mind, I wasn't eating right. It was just total exhaustion, I would say.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And that's very common too, that for women, this time period tends to uh, exist at the same time these other things do. So it's really tough. I'm going to go across my screen as I see. How about Anne? Can you give us a little bit about the physical for you?
Sure. Of course, I lived on a horse farm at the time, and that is physical work, just daily, morning and night. And in the beginning, when my mother or both parents were on the coast, it was a 6-hour drive. And because I was trying to figure out what was happening, I would try to spend several days, maybe a week of every month with them, just so I could find out what's going on, what are the problems, what's at home, what's happening. And at the same time, I was physically dealing with miscarriages. And I remember it was an Easter, and I was spending maybe 5 days with my parents, and I knew that I was having a miscarriage, and I was trying to take care of my parents, and I was just so depleted in every aspect, and just thinking, where is my resurrection? I mean, it just seemed like it was never going to end. And just the exhaustion even of trying to set up care for the horses while I was gone. That's almost really hard. If anybody has animals, you know how hard it is, because they're your babies and you want them to be well taken care of. And then, my own body, and then my parents, it just felt like this never ending cycle of, as Jean said, exhaustion.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Loretta, how about you for the physical strain? How did that show up for you?
Yeah, so this might sound really weird, but one of the most interesting things from our perspective was how good shape my mother was in. And that was, in some respects, a curse. My mother's believed her job was to run away. We were fifth generation Washingtonians. And so when she had to be moved somewhere else, I moved her to Maryland, where I was, but she was determined. She was born in DC. She was going to die there. So every time she ran away and the police would find her, and she said, "Where are you trying to go?" 818 New Hampshire Avenue Northwest. She was determined she was going there, right around the corner from the Kennedy Center and Watergate, right there. House is still there to this day. And so she was in such great shape that it was challenging. She could outrun most people who were half her age. My great grandmother, lived alone till she was 101, and she missed 107 by a couple weeks. So I really appreciate David's story, because I thought my mother would live to be 102, which was another really big scare. So I think from that perspective, it was interesting. One of the things I learned about the physical nature of it and how I had to take care of myself was, an early crazy situation I went through. I was sick for 13 years. I had 21 operations, probably was in the hospital more than 40 times. And I think that 13-year stretch really prepared me to care for my mom. And so I, just kind of had this plan I tried to follow every day of sleeping. I don't need a lot of sleep. You can probably feel my energy. So I don't need a lot of sleep, but I did need some. But I was able to kind of pace that. So really just honestly, because she could lift and move herself until maybe that last year or so, I could avoid a lot of that because, as I said, I mean, even though she didn't live with me, I was there every day. So, you know, and I said my schedule reflected it. So we've really had, I think, an easier time of that. She was determined she was going to do stuff by herself, which sometimes was a problem. She didn't break anything. I mean, one of the times she escaped, she fell in the ditch at 90 and didn't break a thing. When they got to the hospital, the lady that was taking her vitals said, "Your blood pressure is better than mine." I mean, this was like, who falls in the ditch and don't break anything? But anyway, so it was, that was, you know, a negative in a sense. So it was only that last year that I think she broke her clavicle during COVID, but also we didn't find out it was broken for days, you know, because she couldn't articulate pain at that time. And so when she had trouble breathing, we thought she had COVID, but she had broken her clavicle and 4 ribs. She just sat around like nothing was happening. So she was unbelievable, really. So I think I missed some of the physical, and I had learned enough about my own illness that I can't die before her, especially after everybody else had died. So I was determined to, you know, try to pace myself. So I think we did pretty well in the physical category. I just mostly wanted to keep up with her so that, you know, if you turned your head, she just ran off.
Oh my, oh
So
my, yeah.
and I'm one of the few people who talks about the thing we had to put in her shoe. It was the only article of clothing she never took off. So we put a tracker in her shoe. So at least we could find her before too long, before she fell in the ditch somewhere. It's just crazy. So I think we kind of lucked out in that part, but it wore us out for sure.
Oh, that's brilliant that you put something in her shoes.
Yeah.
Well done.
Thank you.
Little safety tip, everybody.
Yes,
There we go.
yes, indeed. Smart Soul, SOLE. That's the name of it. It's
All
brilliant.
right. So David, how's that? You doing okay?
I think for me, the physical problem that was the most challenging was sleep, just lack of sleep. We got to the point where my mom, it wasn't safe for my mom to get up and use the bathroom on her own at night. And my bedroom, which was the same bedroom I'd had as a 10-year-old that I moved back into my mom's house, which was its own interesting experience. It was actually back in the same single bed as I'd had as a 10-year-old. So, but she got to the point where she couldn't use the bathroom safely. So we installed a buzzer next to her bed that she could bring. And I came to call them three bell nights because if she would get up the first time, I would know it was just the first, and then having to get back to sleep, and then knowing I was going to be awakened again. It's sort of like having an alarm clock that just goes off at random intervals through the evening. So I think that was the biggest challenge for me, and what brought some relief to that really was 2 things that both actually have to do with athletics. My mom was a huge sports fan, as was I. And while we shared many things, you know, similar interests, similar politics, the most important thing we shared was we shared the same team. We were both like diehard Stanford University football and basketball fans. And we went to games. They'd gone to games all their lives, my folks. I'd gone to games all my life. And so I would take her to basketball and football games. She was, and believe me, there's nothing quite like going to a college football game with someone who's 101, who's capable of still yelling, "Just tackle that guy, tackle him." So that was, you need great distractions, you know, when you're going through tough times, whether that's anything in life, and that was fantastic. And the other thing for me was that I took up long distance running. I would go out for runs. We were lucky enough to have a caregiver there, as I mentioned earlier, so that I could go out and do that. And being able to get away, number one, and being able to do something physical, but physically regenerative, you know, not exhausting, but something that added something back to you, and staying in good condition, actually, I think is really important. So those were for me, the best ways of contending with the physicality of caregiving and the toll that can take.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful. And I would say, yes, having the same team is a very important thing. So at least you didn't have that friction.
That can get pretty volatile. So let's move on and talk about the money, because I know that for many people that's like top of mind. Financially, long-term dementia care can be overwhelming. The cost of in-home care, adult daycare, or nursing home placement can quickly deplete savings and retirement funds. Caregivers may also face significant out-of-pocket expenses for medications, medical equipment, and home modifications. They may have had to leave their jobs, move away like Dave did, and have to move into a new setting. What financial difficulties did you encounter and how did you manage them? You start with Ann.
Sure. My parents, they were not well off, but they did have a nest egg. My father had been career military. He was also had a depression mentality, which meant he saved every single thing that ever came into the house, which meant there were stacks of junk mail, stacks of magazines, stacks of newspapers, and things that weren't stacked, but every surface that was in the house was covered with stuff. And he and I had always talked finances growing up. So I was the youngest, but I was the natural one for him to just hand things over to. And which the good thing was there was a nest egg. Finding that nest egg was a real challenge because he had like a little bit of money in one account and a little bit in another account. And he was like always trying to squirrel away a few nuts here and there because he just didn't trust anybody or didn't trust the government, even though he was part of the government, he just felt like he always had to have something extra saved. So it took years just to uncover what my parents actually had. And then once I got a handle on it, I was constantly calculating in my head, okay, as I saw the money going out monthly for my mother's care and eventually both parents' care, I was like, okay, we've got 3 years. Okay, we've got 18 months. We've got 16 months. I was just watching and thinking, I don't know what we're going to do, but we'll figure it out when the time comes. If, my siblings and I have to take them in, we will gladly do that. But it was just a constant source of stress. And, just we were lucky though, because the money was there once I found it. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. Oddly, it ended up covering almost, I would say she maybe had a month or two left over after my mom passed away. So it really worked out well.
Great. Loretta, what about you?
Well, that was definitely the hardest part of this for me. So, so the historical part of my mom's thing, she was a federal government employee, but back then African Americans could typically be like grade 7, usually the highest. And so her retirement check was $1,300. That barely bought a closet in DC. She was a saver too. So we had all kinds of savings bonds. She had all that going on. But clearly wasn't enough. In the non-assisted living, she moved into after my grandparents died. I was born in my grandparents' house accidentally. My mother thought she had indigestion. And my mother lived there after my grandparents died, but then when that house was huge. So we sold that, we went to this non-assisted living place, and she could afford that. They had a lower income rent, so she could afford that. She always got the reduced rent. So she saved that, the rest of that $1,300. That's how thrifty, she was, because meals were included and all that. So what I didn't realize when she was diagnosed was that eventually she wasn't going to be able to live by herself. I didn't realize that right away. I know that sounds crazy, but I didn't. And so I never thought about money was going to be an issue down the road because she was so thrifty. So where it got interesting was when I did have to move her, then we had to add, obviously to the rent. What I didn't know was that there was such a thing called the waiver program, which is a Medicaid kind of thing where they take whatever your monthly income is as your full rent. So I tell every caregiver that they put your name on every single list that comes up. Because, you know, if you think of yourself, oh, I don't need that right now, put your name on the list because the lists are so long that. So when I signed my mother up for the waiver program, there were 23,842 people on the list. I'm going to just let that sink in. So it took 8 years, 6 months, and a few days for us to get off that list. So when Tim was alive, you know, we were paying like 400 or 500 a month for her, and then it kept going up. After he died, it got to $1,500 a month. So I never intended to write a book. I'm gonna be 100% transparent and say I wrote the first book because that was how I was gonna pay for my mother's care. So every speech I gave, every book I sold went to that. And she used to always say, I pay for everything myself. I'm like, keep thinking that. And as I ran off to sell more books. And so I let her, she was so proud of that she lived on her own and not with her children, and she was financing everything. I'm like, mm-hmm. So it was terrifying. But I remember the day we were in the New York Times, I think it sold 1,000 copies or something. I was like, okay, that is 6 months rent. And so, and I'm doing the calculations too, but in reverse. And so, man, I just kept, you know, yeah, that was the scariest part, I think, for me. And, you know, the list got so long, they eventually had to dismantle the list altogether because you were never going to get to all those people on the list. So I count myself very lucky that I was able to get her into that program, you know, at the end. So that's why my friends were saying, bring her to your house, especially after Tim died, bring her to your house and, you know, all of that. But I wasn't going to do that. She wanted to be in, and one of the last things she said to me, and she said, you are my lifesaver. Thank you for letting me live, you know, on my own. I was like, you are so welcome. And so that was pretty much how it ended. So I'm thrilled I was able to do that, but it was a struggle. So I just tell everybody, go to your Department of Aging, learn all the programs they have or don't have, and, you know, get yourself situated that if you don't have that kind of nest egg, you can do it, because that's the greatest trauma, I think, is feeling you left the person that raised you down because they didn't have enough and you didn't have it, you know. Now I have a, you know, so conversely, my 401's pretty good. So I could just kind of sit here like, whoo, but it was, you know, we learned from that thing of what we need to do.
Thank you so much, Loretta. David, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I'm really glad we're talking about this topic because it's one of the things, like many aspects of caregiving, that doesn't get discussed enough. I think there's so much naivete really about the cost of aging and of caregiving and of providing for that. What I want to say is that I was incredibly lucky. And here's why. We could have caregivers, as I've mentioned, during the day, and over time we could expand the number of hours that were there. And here's why. It's because my parents bought a home in Menlo Park, California, in the heart of what would become Silicon Valley in 1950 for $15,000. So that by the time I moved back in with my mom in 2007, it was worth just a little bit more. And that meant I could borrow against the house again and again and again to pay for care. Because by the end of my mom's life, we were spending, because toward the very end, I needed care there all the time. It was costing $14,000 a month to do that. So I was lucky. But good care in this country should not depend on good luck, you know? Mm-hmm. And that's where we are. That is the hard truth of where we are. And there is so much more we need to do as a country if we're going to provide good care to the people who need and deserve that. And we need to be aware of that. We are living in a time now where people don't seem to think much about government and government programs. Well, this is where we need a government plan. It's not enough to simply say, well, make sure your parents owned a home in Menlo Park, California in 1950 and you'll be fine. You know, that is not exactly a national elder care.
Yeah.
So I will stop with that. As you can tell, I have pretty strong feelings about this. but it's something we really, really need to face as a country, and we have not.
You are so right. Thank you for saying that. It's an important topic. Jean, can you add something?
Personally, I was very lucky that I was able to continue to work full time when my parents were ill. I did not get to the point that I had to give up my own job. And I was very thankful for that. My parents had been savers all of their lives as well. We lived in a very small town. My employer, because I had longevity in my school system, I had a lot of sick time, and my employer was very cognizant and compassionate about my situation and gave me time when I needed to be off for appointments or whatever with my parents. As I mentioned before, though, selling their house when they were still alive was tough, and perhaps made tougher because we lived in such a small town, and my parents had been well-respected business owners in that town. And so, and I wanted to be very careful about their healthcare privacy. So I didn't talk a lot about what was happening with them. And so as I'm cleaning out the house and selling it, you know, people are thinking, but your parents are still alive. Why are you cleaning this out and selling their house? And so that increased the guilt in me as well, thinking I'm selling their belongings and to pay for their care, and they are still alive. So, but it's something that we have to do. We have to find the funds somewhere to pay for care.
Right. I went through that with my mom, and she would go back and forth with me, where one day she'd say to me, I understand. It's okay if you have to sell my house. And then the next week she'd say, don't you dare sell my house. So I had to sell. I sold her. She passed away a couple of weeks. I had a buyer already when she died. So I know what that was like. And Christy, you have a different story if you want to share.
Well, just briefly, I'm like many of you, we may have had parents all around the same time, right? You know, my parents I'm a baby boomer, so they were the ones before that. They were the silent generation, right? And they were Depression era kids, and so they saved everything. It was a wake-up call to my husband and I, because when we started caring for my parents, they had saved their money well, and my dad was a salesman. My mom was also a third grade teacher. And so, you know, it's not like they had millions, but they had enough that they could manage their life. And that was a wake up call to my husband and I to start looking at, we need to have our affairs in order too, because you never know, right? Even though our kids they were young, but so that's one thing. And to David's point, I believe there are now more people over the age of 75 in this country than there are kids under the age of 5, right? So when you think about, I don't have the numbers, but when you think about the number of kids who might need daycare versus the number of adults who might need care, we have a huge imbalance, because there's a lot of people like in my group, the baby boomers, we're getting old, you know? And so we have to address this. I think the financial thing is huge for so many people, and just hearing all of your stories, you know, we were lucky because but luck is not a strategy.
It is not.
So that is a hard truth that we have to kind of look at. So for ourselves and for people that we may care for. So that's all I wanted to say about that. But our next pillar is around social isolation, and caring for a loved one with dementia can often lead to social isolation. Caregivers may find it difficult to maintain friendships and hobbies as their time and energy are consumed by caregiving responsibilities. And this isolation can exacerbate feelings of loneliness, stress, depression, and it might even be hard to talk about. There's still stigma around dementia diagnoses. So just wanted to kind of throw it out to all of you. What did you do to keep in touch with friends, to not be isolated, activities and routines? So maybe we'll start with, let's start with Loretta. You want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about how you dealt with social isolation?
Sure. I just made sure she was active. You know, AARP does these profiles on caregivers, and mine was titled the entertainment director. That's what they named me because I was always doing stuff. If you look it up, that's what pops up. And, you know, we were big Kennedy Center people and, you know, all kinds of stuff she loved to do. And I just tried to keep that going. And so, people would send me stuff to try out with my mom. We did all kinds of activities. People think we only did Lego. That is not true. That was her favorite by far, and mine too. But we did a lot of other things. She had the same best friend from kindergarten. I got them together for their birthdays and all that kind of stuff. They died 10 days apart. So they really were together their entire lives. And so she wasn't social, nothing like me, but her little circle of friends, you know, we did a lot with them. And then the non-retirement building she lived in, they had a lot of stuff going on. She was very active, which was surprising to me. And then at the group home where she died, they had an activity director, even though it was a small, the lady owned 3 group homes, but they had tea parties. I have a picture right over here, this big hat, you know, they did all kinds of stuff. So I was very lucky in that sense that she loved to do certain things. She wasn't just gonna sit around and chat. It had to be some kind of function or something. But, you know, I kept her as active as I could, because I'll be honest and say I hated that blank stare, and I was going to do anything to eliminate it. So for us, the social part was easy.
And how about you? Did you ever feel isolated from friends or from others who could support you in your caregiving journey?
No, because I was in a lot of groups that, you know, people knew, you know, everybody's situation, you know, support groups. So I had a lot of that. You know, so that was, even at work, I agree with Jean. When you have a great supporter, you know, person, you know, if a meeting went past 2 o'clock, they would say, "Aren't you supposed to be at your mom's?" And I would jump in the car. So they were really supportive of what I was doing. So yeah.
Fantastic.
Mhm.
Anne, how about you?
I felt extremely isolated, starting in my early 30s into my 40s. I think I was mostly isolated because none of my peers were going through anything like this. And so there was a particular time when my mom was actually staying at our house. And I remember thinking, I am going to go crazy because we had to keep the doors locked. I had to keep my eyes on her all the time. She was about to get into some kind of a dangerous situation, whether it was turning on the stove or putting dishes or things away, you know, from the dishwasher, like, "Oh, Mom, don't handle the knives." And I couldn't even call anybody on the phone because she would listen in and be very angry and suspicious about, you know, what is she talking about? She's talking about me. And so, and my friends at that point didn't really know, you know, early on. Eventually my friends did know, and they, you know, my church actually was just a wonderful support. But in the beginning, I was just like dangling out there in the wind. But I did have a couple of things that helped me a lot. And one was I was a member of a couple of writing groups. And even if that was the only time I got away, because I was a freelance writer, I was doing my work at home. But if I got away to my writing group, you know, my husband, I would be like, this is sacred time. I have got to spend time with these people. And they were so wonderful, and they were encouraging me as I was doing my writing. And as I wrote about my mom, it was very nourishing because it was sort of like I could bring the old mom back, and I just felt this real connection to her. And I knew that because she loved writing too, it was like I felt her joy in my writing. So that was such a gift. And the other thing that I did, because we had a horse farm, when I wasn't exhausted, if I could just go out and watch the horses graze or get on for an afternoon ride and just, you know, wrap my legs around a horse and feel the movement and feel the air on my skin and the sunshine and, you know, just be in the moment for a little while. That was really helpful to me.
Very beautiful. Thank you so much. How about you, David?
I think for me, and again, this goes back to my being so lucky to have the resources borrowing against my mom's house to be able to have caregivers, is that I wasn't really that isolated. Like Jean, I could work, and I found work enormously helpful. It was work I loved, making documentary film and hosting a show on radio. And that was really nourishing. And I just think having other people in your life who understand the best they can what you're going through. Lynn, the woman who would later become my wife, also an elementary school teacher, so there's probably a common denominator in that. Having an elementary school teacher in your life is useful, I think. You know, was incredibly supporting, as was my adult daughter. And I had a good friend whose husband had Alzheimer's, and we could just talk because it's so great when you can talk to someone who knows where you're at, because you start on, you don't have to go back to the table of contents. You know, you can pick up the conversation on page 147 because they've already been through the first 146 pages. I think that's really, really, really crucial. And last thing I'd say is that it's something I've tried to remember since my mom passed away, is that to remember our friends who are now caregivers and be there for them and to offer them something concrete. You know, we've all said a million times in our life, well, let me know if I can be helpful, which is basically kind of worthless. So, you know, but to say instead, I'm going to the grocery store. Can I pick up a half gallon of milk for you? You know, or let me come over and sit with Steve, you know, so you can go for a long walk. I think providing that kind of concrete, tangible connection is so crucial. And we've probably all had the good fortune to experience some of that. And I think to encourage people and to encourage ourselves to provide that to others who are in this circumstance is really crucial to not being isolated.
So true. Very true. Thank you so much. Jean, how about you? How did you handle some isolation that you might have felt?
I think the experience of working full time and taking care of mom and dad made me extremely efficient with my time. So I would get to work early and leave immediately because I had another job to go to. I did not share what was happening with my coworkers except for two who I suspected were going through the same things. They had recently lost a loved one. And we would walk in the building in the morning and just touch base. How was your night? And then because I lived in such a small town and I was very conscious of my parents' healthcare privacy, I didn't share with the community what was happening either. And so for those reasons, I did feel isolated throughout the experience. And it's interesting because then people from my community or coworkers who have read my book have said, we had no idea what you were going through, none at all. And so I think I could have had more support if I could have opened up about it, but I was too busy to, and I was just protective of them as well.
Sure. I totally get that. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Why don't we do a lightning round at the very end here for our pillow, which is coping strategies. We kind of touched on this a little bit because we know the challenges of long-term dementia caregiving are significant, but there are strategies that can help caregivers cope and maintain their well-being. So if you could think of any strategy that might have worked for you, and that you could share that maybe other people can pick up on, that would be helpful. David?
Exercise
Okay.
would be one. Staying connected, I think, is really important as well. And remembering that, as the great baseball announcer Vin Scully once observed, talking about how people refer to injured athletes as being day to day, and Vin Scully said, "Well, actually, we're all day to day." And that's true for us as care providers, and it's true for the person we're taking care of. That person is day to day too, and to just be kind and to be loving, and to try the best we can as a society to become a more loving society, honestly, because that's in the end what this is about.
Beautiful. Thank you. Loretta?
I would just say, try to have joy every day. When she was diagnosed, that's the only thing I could promise her that day, because I had no idea what Alzheimer's even was. So I didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep. I knew I could bring her some joy every day. And so when she died with Lego bricks in her hand, that she had played with that same day, I felt like I had done my job. So every time people say, "Why are you always talking about joy? Your mom's dying." I'm like, "Yeah, but it ain't probably not going to be today." So I tried to have joy all the days. She understood it, because she would always say, "That was our joy when we had fun." I was like, "Yes." And so we did it. And that's my thing, joy. So
Thank you so much. Ann?
Two things come to mind, other than exercise, like Dave says. One is just being out in the sun and just appreciating a few minutes of sunshine. The other is allowing yourself moments of grief, so that I have felt if I do that, I sort of clear out the system so that it allows joy in. I feel much more in tune with myself. If I'm able to grieve, then the joy and the beauty of life also shines through.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Jean, you get the last word.
Going to my day job was my coping strategy. It was predictable. Those 8 and 9-year-old faces, the voices, their activity level, there is little time to think about anything else during the day. And they really were the beautiful part of my life at that point, I think.
Thank you. That reminds me of a colleague I had when I worked in case management at a hospital, and she had a lot of stuff going on at her house, and you can just imagine what it's like in that working in that kind of hospital environment. It was just one stressor and catastrophe after another. And she would say to me, "This is my peace." I used to just laugh, because like she had so much going on at home that was wild. So when she would say that to me, I mean, we'd be in the middle of chaos. "This is my peace." So, it's so fun. I guess everything is on how you look at it. Well, I want to thank you all for being on our panel. I appreciate it so much, and I appreciate those who have stayed with us in the audience. So thank you all for attending the long haul, the long-term impact of caregiving. Our next All's Authors Live presentation will be on April 29th as we celebrate National Poetry Month with many of our authors. This will be our 3rd annual event and promises to be inspiring, uplifting, and educational. Please email us at allsauthors.com for the registration form. In the meantime, please check out our podcast and YouTube channel for replays of previous panel discussions like this one, book club meetings, and interviews with our authors. Visit allsauthors.com for details. Please check your inbox each week for news from us, introducing our newest author, podcasts, special events, and more. We are a 501c3 organization supported by donations only. If you'd like to contribute to our mission to provide quality resources for dementia caregivers, please visit allsauthors.com/donate. You can find us on social media at Facebook, X, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, where we share a wealth of resources for the dementia journey daily. Please follow us. Remember, you are not alone. One can sing a lonely song, but we chose to form a choir and create harmony. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, everyone.